next. And this is kind of very relevant. I like the idea that, sort of happens in pockets, even in large organizations. But I want to talk about why you think business leaders have embraced this concept so much.
I think there's a couple of things. I think one is just on a personal level. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of these CEOs, and they truly want their business to be about more than just sort of a legacy of money and sort of capital creation. They see all the problems in the world, and they do authentically want to be part of that, but they can't do that on their own often. There's so many pressures around short-term thinking and around sort of what a business should be. And it often takes just an extra dose of courage for a CEO to be able to make that leap and to be able to convince their investors, their board, et cetera, to make that leap to be truly an ethical, purpose-driven, mindset as a leader. And I think what the Business Roundtable did, which I thought was just fantastic, was it took away a lot of that risk. It basically allowed a lot of these people to come out of the closet as purpose-driven leaders who wanted to be this way, but needed to have that group to create safety to make that statement. So I don't have a cynical point of view. I think it very authentically comes from leaders wanting their organizations to be this way and just not wanting to be out on their own doing that. Not just because it's sort of marketing-wise scary, but also I think most people just don't know how to do it yet. So the idea that they're all in it together learning, I think also creates some safety there. And then I think there's a market pressure, right? Which I think we all read about all the time, which is, employees are demanding this, talent overall. There's, ups and downs, but overall right now, talent market is incredibly tight, and the power is in people, especially in knowledge workers, software developers, et cetera, and being able to be the employer that, where they want to work. And there's also with, social media and with the complexity now of marketing, it's really hard to stand out in the marketplace if you don't have a message that aligns with the values of what people are doing, and where you're not building products that are designed with psychology in mind to have them meet a need that keeps them loyal to your brand and loyal to your product. So there's a very strong personal case for it for these leaders, and then a very strong market case for this. And at this point, I think it has crossed that chasm where to say that you're not this way stands out more than saying that you are, which I think is sort of that tipping point, I think, overall, to say that we are now, I think, in a purpose economy.
Aaron, I'd like to jump in here to build on that. So obviously the economy has gone through an interesting period here in the last few months. And so if that balance tips, if we see, we've seen a number of organizations starting to lay off workers. If that really tips, do you think that that's going to have a hit on this vision of the purpose economy if we're not in such a tight talent market?
I think short term, but I think longer term, these things go up and down. And I think the cat is out of the bag in terms of people now understanding more about psychology, understanding more about their needs, sort of being empowered with that message. I look at my kids and what they're being taught in the school right now, which is really around this sort of purpose first mindset towards work. So I think it's going to be really hard to go sort of backwards. And I think we can see, a blip there. And I think it's also to look at looking at where we are right now in context. A lot of the problems in the world right now are actually because of purpose. And I really like to point out, purpose isn't this only good thing, this only sort of positive force. Purpose is why we want to be part of tribes. That's why we want to be feeling like a connection to community. And that's creating a lot of the political problems that we have right now. People want to be part of something bigger than themselves, and something bigger than yourself can be positive or negative. So I think a lot of these forces also they're not all positive. I think we have to understand that purpose and psychology is sort of being used to do good and to do something completely other.
Yeah. And one of the things we talked about in the report that I think is a shift too is we have historically derived a lot of our purpose outside of work. So if you think about maybe in our communities or our churches and other institutions, and as some of those institutions have become maybe less prevalent in some people's lives, a lot of people are looking to their work to get that sense of purpose. So I think we've seen a permanent shift in terms of how people are thinking about purpose. Yeah. I
think that's absolutely right. And we actually did a study with PwC last year and sort of looked at how fulfilled people were at work and how fulfilled they were in their lives overall. We found other people who said they were fulfilled in their lives. So it's overall, I am fulfilled in totality. Only 1% of those people said they weren't fulfilled at work. So I think also, not only is it that, maybe faith and religious institutions and some of these community organizations are shrinking, I think it's also a recognition in research and psychology that we're one human being and we have a single mindset and a single approach to life. And the sort of whole idea of work can just be work and you're going to meet the needs for fulfillment outside of work looks statistically just not a common occurrence at all.
This is a great cue to go and dive into the implications for HR. I think Danny's going to take the lead on some questions around that. Are you good to go, Danny?
Yeah, I am. I think this has been a really interesting conversation so far, Aaron. I think you're much more optimistic than I am.
Depends on the day.
Kind of gives me a little bit of hope. I'm curious, first of all, do you see a difference in organizations that you would consider sort of purpose-aligned or purpose-driven organizations? Do you see a difference in the way that they deal with their people, so the talent management aspect?
Oh, I think absolutely. The ones that are doing it authentically are moving away from the idea of human resources and thinking of people as resources and like truly thinking of people as human beings, and starting to really humanize their work practices and how they think about their people. And I think this has been accelerated due to COVID and the pandemic, where it's hard to see people as anything other than human beings right now in many organizations. So I think that that's absolutely the case. And I think there are companies that have just done the marketing version of purpose, and for them often there isn't that actual internal shift. But I think that's going to be a very short-lived phenomenon, because those people are not going to stay there because they're going to see that that's just a veneer. Mm-hmm. So seeing an absolute change there, and you see this in the interaction between a CHRO, and a CEO at some of these companies, where it's not just about like how engaged are my employees, what is the productivity of my employees, but it's about truly caring about their people and truly making sure that their needs are met and they're set up to be their best self. And it's this, whole movement of bring your full self to work. It's this whole movement around inclusion. It's the movement around, enabling people to have much more autonomy. A lot of these things are really tied to the same thread and the same set of values.
Yeah. Well, we've seen a big uptick in conversations around well-being and stress management and those types of things, especially since COVID started. It started a couple of years ago, but especially since COVID.
Absolutely. It's accelerated for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I'm wondering, do you see in those organizations that you would deem sort of purpose-driven or purpose-aligned, are employees generally more engaged and connected, and as a result of that, more innovative and productive and all of the things that most traditional types of organizations are looking for?
It's all over the map. I think it, again, depends on like how the company or organization is interpreting it. So give you an example, like nonprofit organizations chronically over-index to impact as the form of purpose and cause, and often therefore underinvest in the two other critical areas for people, which are the relationships and growth. So we've seen in research that actually like the level of fulfillment in many nonprofits is really not any better than in corporations. And in some cases, it's much worse. So I think it's really important to sort of understand that you can't just provide purpose and a sense of impact without also addressing the relationships and the growth piece. And I think the companies that are, finding success now are the ones that are linking all three of those elements together to give a much more sort of holistic view of what's going to take for an employee to truly thrive. And that's where we're seeing that difference. I think the ones that are just focused on impact often start to implode on themselves because it's like a one-legged stool, which I know is mixing metaphors. You'd have an imploding stool, but you sort of get the point. Like it's not how we work as human beings. We need all three of those things: the relationships, the impact, and the growth.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Some of the work that Stacia, it definitely makes sense, Aaron. Some of the work that Stacia did over the summer was on purpose-driven organizations. And one of the big discussions we had at the beginning of that, I don't want to call it an argument, but discussions that we had at the beginning of that had to do with what exactly is purpose in organizations. And one of the things that sort of came out of that was paying attention to more than just your external stakeholders. So the things that you said about employees as stakeholders is really resonating. Do you think there are things that leaders in more traditional types of companies can learn from those that you would deem purpose-aligned or purpose-driven?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to try to help them break it down into smaller pieces. I think it sometimes feels like this giant jump. And I think, first of all, start off by looking at your current bright spots. So even the worst companies out there do things that I would put in the category of purpose. They may be a very small minority of their activities, but instead of starting with deficit thinking of we aren't this, it's sort of saying, where are we this? Mm-hmm. Where are we doing things to humanize work? Where are we doing stakeholder engagement? Where are we building products and services in a way in which it's aligned with our values? And figure out how do we do more of that and amplify it versus starting off with this mindset of like, oh, we're nothing like these other organizations. There's always at least like a dash of DNA in every organization that has this, whether that's a person, a group, a leader. There's always something you can build on. And just starting with that and building from it, that sort of positive deviant, if you will, to me is always the best place to start.
Right on. So we know that the traditional measurements of success are often more geared toward how an organization is doing in the marketplace or in the market in general. how do we measure purpose? How do we measure whether or not organizations have purpose and what impact that's having on some of the more traditional types of stuff?
Well, so I think there's the HR piece and then there's like the consumer community piece. So I think to your point, stakeholder engagement is a huge part of this, and whether or not an organization is actually doing those activities, which is much more of an activity measurement, is a pretty strong indicator. From an HR standpoint, again, I go back to, we've developed this measurement of fulfillment, which we think is sort of the byproduct of working in a purpose-driven culture, which is, looking at the relationships impacting growth that your employees are reporting, and to use that as your barometer of whether or not the stakeholder being your employees are sort of thriving and are they working in alignment with your values around purpose. And I think those simple 3 questions about, do your employees have meaningful relationships? Because we know the majority of people don't. Are they making an impact that's meaningful to them? And are they growing in a way that matters to them? If you optimize for those 3 things, like that alone creates the cascading changes that are necessary. So I really encourage, and a lot of our corporate partners that are using our platform are starting to use that as their sort of primary indicator of the sort of health, well-being, fulfillment, purpose, whatever you want to say, of their employee base, instead of the antiquated old engagement measurement, which is rooted in a human resources mindset. And then on the consumer side, a lot of what I've seen and talked to folks about is using those same 3 things: relationships, impact, and growth, and saying, how are your products or services helping people build relationships, make an impact, or growing? So, for example, my wife, as the Chief Sustainability Officer at Amazon, just launched today the ability to search for products on Amazon based on their impact on the climate, right? So that's enabling their consumers to actually make an impact, right? So by doing that, you're actually selling purpose in a way, because you're enabling people to be part of that solution. Or if you're at a company where you're helping people actually strengthen, relationships with each other, or pushing them and stretching them, how are you doing those things in your operations, in your products and services, is a pretty good proxy, and trying to get away from just cause as the outcome, because cause is way too simplistic.
I think that makes sense. Just one more question. I sit on the board of an ESOP, which is an employee-owned organization, and
yep.
I expected going into that experience that it would just be a purpose-driven organization. They're in Vermont, so I kind of assumed that would
odds are high to begin with that, right?
That would sort of feed into it, and then the whole idea of employee-owned. I assumed that they would spend quite a bit of effort on employees and employees as a stakeholder and stuff like that. And they do, but I'm still surprised at the metrics that we use are still mostly externally facing. So I'm just wondering, in these organizations, do you see a trade-off between maybe some of the more traditional profitability metrics against some of the ones that you just talked about? Or do you see organizations being able to balance both?
I think it's a new muscle that companies are trying to figure out how to balance. And I think the bigger challenge is short-term versus long-term, because I think a lot of what we're talking about today, has been shown to have a better ROI, but it's not necessarily like a 1 day, 1 week, 1 quarter ROI. And it's getting out of that mindset that's actually the bigger challenge. And then I think it's unlearning a lot of things, right? Unlearning that there's a lot of things we do as companies that are just legacy behaviors that when you actually unpack them and realize where they came from, they're not aligned with your values. And, I think that's where a lot of my thinking around employee engagement and this sort of idea of how do we maximize output per human widget. I don't think anyone really wants to treat their people that way, but that's really where, that whole movement came from. And, I think once we look at the root of those things, we can start to re-engineer, redesign a lot of how we lead when we're conscious of like the origins of those old practices that aren't aligned with our values.
I have a question I want to ask in this section, and it's we think a lot about work, right? And clearly, how people work is changing, or feels like it's changing really, really rapidly, and maybe even accelerated this year by the pandemic.
For sure,
you have this lovely table in your book called the 12 New Work Rules, where it's kind of from and to kind of model. And for example, you talk about, in the old world, people were preoccupied about climbing a career ladder. Now it's about finding meaning in the work they do every day. In the old world, it was, retirement was a good thing. That's what we were all marching towards. In the new world, we're never going to stop trying to make an impact. and so on and so forth. And I think the culmination one is, the command used to be a professional, and now it's kind of be a human. Mm-hmm. I love this table because I think it really sort of illustrates how the